Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. I want to start today a little different. Again, as always, thank you all for joining me in this practice as we examine deeply the teachings of the Buddha. But today I want to take a minute because it's kind of a special teaching today. And I want to just kind of recognize that, I'm very fortunate to be here today with you guys practicing and talking about these things. And I say that because I have seen these teachings have a profound impact in my life. I've seen it with my heart. And when I come here today, it's not because I have some magical super understanding or something. There's nothing in the speaker that is significant here. It's because I've heard these things. I've seen these things from great wise teachers. I've read the suttas and I've looked at them deeply. And so out of that arises a thing. And today we're going to dig into we're going to start talking about the most important teachings of the Buddha. And so before I did that, I just wanted to thank my teachers. I wanted to thank all the conditions that have come together to bring me here to you today, and how grateful I am for this teaching that I've learned to treasure. And I'll start. And the reason why we start this way is because we know this is just a teaching that we've seen, that we've heard, that this isn't a singular experience. And so we always start with, thus have I heard. So thus have I heard. If you Google what is Buddhism, then you're going to find out about the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths, the things that the Buddha said are fundamentally true to all of us and worthy of us paying attention to. And what we've been studying for the past 10 weeks is not those Four Noble Truths. What we've been studying for the past 10 weeks is really what he taught us on how to practice, how to look at reality. And he starts there. And he says, take a look for yourself and see if you find these things are true. And we learned a lot by looking. We learned a lot about who we are, what we are, and how that stuff comes and goes. And we've been doing that for a while. But the reason why we do this seeking is because humans innately are seeking some kind of answer. And there's something that brings you here today. And so before I dig into my talk really deeply, which I got to say has a lot of words in it, there's a lot of writing in today because this is a long bit of text that we're examining. But I really value the group discussion. And so I open up some discussion on what brings us here. What is this? And really, this is the question, this is the existential question of human beings. What is life about? And that's a tough one to drop on a group and say, hey, gang, ask the most meaningful and existential questions. So I'll tell you, I reached out to somebody that I knew would know what these questions are for all humans, and that was ChatGPT. And I asked ChatGPT, I said, I bet you get a lot of existential questions. Like the most common thing that people sit down, first time they're going to go to ChatGPT, and they ask it the most profound questions. And I said, what are those questions? And that's where we're going to start. Existential questions. I hope you're all seeing my existential questions. Sharing my screen. Yes. So here are the top 10 questions that GPT gets for existential questions. It's, what is the meaning of life? Is there a higher power or divine being? What happens after death? What is the nature of reality? What is the nature of good and evil? What is true happiness or fulfillment? What is the nature of time? What is the significance of human consciousness? What is the purpose of suffering? And what is the ultimate fate of the universe? So those are big questions we start with today. And I suppose I would ask, doesn't that just generally make sense to the group? That humans seem to be chasing these questions, like generally that's part of life. Would you agree with that? Roughly. Well, I'll continue to share and we'll look at, so those are existential questions. And I'm sorry, let me make that better. Try that again. And so then those are pretty profound. Those are big seeking questions. But oh, the questions, and I'm sorry because I am navigating this not well. The questions that we experience a lot of times, the human questions that drive us, are more like this. How do I get what I want? How can I hold on to what matters to me most? How can I shield myself from pain and betrayal? Will I ever find love, or am I destined to be alone? Do I truly matter to anyone, or am I just alone in this world? Can I trust anyone, or is everyone just out for themselves? Who's trying to tear down everything I've worked for, and why? How do I stop others from taking what's rightfully mine? Am I truly worthy, or am I just fooling myself? How can I outdo and impress everyone else? So I'm throwing these two sets of questions at you as what brings us here, right? What drove the Buddha himself? What drove Siddhartha? Like, there's a human questioning thing happen. Do you see those existential questions and those intrinsic questions of life and how they come about? Yeah. And there's a reason why I'm starting this way, obviously. There's a reason why I'm driving at these questions, because I think that's the same thing that was driving Siddhartha. You know, the story goes that he was living such an opulent life with everything he could desire that he was shocked when he saw suffering happening profoundly in the world. And that shock is the thing that brought him to refine these questions. Is there a way that we can get behind all of them, get behind the existential questions of life, the universe, and everything, and the intrinsic questions of how do I get what I want, keep what I want, take care of myself? Is there a way that we can get behind all of those things? Because that had to be the driving thing for Siddhartha, who went and practiced all the ways that were available to transcend those existential questions. And so Siddhartha starts asking, what is the wise thing to look at? What is it that is the most beneficial of these questions? What's worthy and not worthy? What's considered by the most wise? And that's where the word Arya comes in Pali. Arya refers to qualities or individuals that are both wise and worthy of respect. It denotes not only the noble or spiritual nature of those who deeply understood and embodied the teachings of the Buddha or, Brahma, but also the principles and practices that are considered enlightened and virtuous. Thus, Arya encapsulates the essence of what is regarded as noble or venerable. So Arya is the Pali term for noble. When we say the Four Noble Truths, we're saying the four Arya truths. And he's saying these are the four things that everything boils down to. So here's four questions contemplated by the wise, based on kind of summarizing all that other stuff that we have. What is the tough stuff in life about? I mean, isn't that really the conundrum? It's like whether you're saying, how can I one up my life, or how can I take care of myself, or how can I get what I want? It's really, how can I do something about the tough stuff? And why do we then experience the tough stuff? Because if the tough stuff would go away and we were just left with all the good stuff, that would be most ideal, right? We seek the best stuff and we're constantly trying to find that good stuff and good way of life. So is there any way to avoid the tough stuff in life? And if there's a way to avoid the tough stuff in life, what explicitly can we do about it? This is what the Buddha, what Siddhartha considered Arya, or noble questions. The tough stuff, well, this. And it becomes really difficult to just group it all and say, well, some of that, we call it suffering, but, and you see there, we lead to suffering and stress at the bottom, but tumult, desolation, oppression, dejection, hardship, anxiety, yeah, this is the tough stuff. And the reason why I walk through this way before we start digging into the sutta is because I don't know that the word suffering or stress is really a perfect definition of what Siddhartha was trying to say. I think that we got to stick with his word because it's not a perfect definition. But the word that he used was dukkha. And this is the one. He says, if you look behind the big, tough question, the tough stuff in life, if you look at what the noble question of what do we do about the tough stuff is, he says the tough stuff is dukkha. Du is a prefix that denotes difficulty, pain, or discomfort. Ka is a word that relates to an empty space or a hole. So you could call dukkha the discomfortable space. You could say the hole in my life of difficulty and despair. And you'd be pointing to dukkha. And I found this really interesting. It's often described metaphorically in ancient texts as referring to the axle hole of a wheel. If the axle does not fit perfectly in the hole, it would cause a bumpy or uncomfortable ride. And some of that is why one of the most common definitions of dukkha is dissatisfaction, is that discomfort is not satisfactory, that all of those, that dissatisfaction in life leaves us chasing those questions. And I love this metaphor because I think of Siddhartha. Here's a guy who travels on chariots and carts a lot. And he spends his life, if you're going to go from one town to the next as the head of the local clan, you're going to travel on a cart and chariot on a rocky, bumpy road. And the most difficult parts of the trip are the ones that you have to endure because it's really bumpy. So if the axle doesn't fit the wheel well, if it just doesn't quite fit and it makes everything bumpy, then it creates a discomfort that Siddhartha would relate to that in a chariot is like being hit with a jackhammer. Imagine riding in a chariot that's bumping up and down on a rocky road. So the metaphor of dukkha is in many ways perfect. And I don't know that I can get around the word dukkha, though we're going to talk about stress. I'm going to take a deep breath and see if this makes sense so far to everybody before we dig into our text, and if there's any thoughts or questions.
I totally agree with you on dukkha being not translatable to English, and I agree with you on using it. And I love that deep dive into the axle. Also, I would like to celebrate your PowerPoint and game right now. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think it helps us all to slow it all down. And that's what I'm really attempting to do, because we're going to read the text in a minute that we've been going through. And unlike the other weeks we've done where there's just like a paragraph, this is a lot of text. And we're not going to get through the Four Noble Truths today. We're going to talk about dukkha because it's the cornerstone. So any other thoughts anybody else got before I continue?
Dukkha is a bummer, man.
Yeah, it's a bummer. It's a drag.
It's a bummer.
You know what? Yeah, let's do that for a minute before we go on, because there's so many good words. You know what? There's a word the other day I hadn't heard since the 70s. There's a good definition. The pits. This is the pits. People used to say, this is the pits, man. It's a drag, right? Yes. So there's a lot of words that you can use to define dukkha, but in the end, dukkha unifies them all. It means that it is fundamental. To be able to say dukkha and to say, yes, we agree, dukkha, it has a lot of synonyms, means that it is a fundamental thing that's difficult to communicate. but we can all understand it.
And I see it as almost like any sense of being in disharmony, right? Like any kind of like, this doesn't seem to fit. Should I be,
Yeah.
wait, I have discussed this feeling. Even if something is fabulous and like, even if you've dreamed of something, it's very possible to have the sense of, should I be somewhere else? Like it's very possible to be somehow uncomfortable, even in a paradise state, which I think is what the Buddha found was so annoying, even though he had all the money in the world. It's like very possible.
And there you go. Yeah, that's just it. It's like, but as we talk about the Four Noble Truths, part of why I bring up the word Arya and want to stick with that is to point out also that he's talking about these are the things worthy of consideration. This is what the noble would consider. These are worthy of consideration. So you can look at dukkha and you could say, well, everything stinks, so I need to really stick it to my neighbor and protect myself, right? Like everyone out for themselves. And there's different ways to kind of associate to that, but he's saying fundamentally, these are the questions. This is the thing. And all of the work we've done so far is to sharpen our minds looking at our experience. And so that we can look directly at our experience and now turn our gaze of that experience to the Four Noble Truths. So back to my presentation. So the Four Noble Truths, the answers to those four Arya questions that I put out there, the four Arya truths, are the noble truth of suffering. This is often described as that the fundamental human experience includes suffering, that it's unified, that suffering is there and exists, that this thing, this dukkha, the noble truth of dukkha is that it does in fact exist. Dukkha samadya arya sacha, the noble truth of the origin of suffering. So how does suffering begin? Dukkha nirodha arya sacha, the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. How does it end? Dukkha nirodha gamini pada arya sacha, the noble truth of the path that leads to the extinction of suffering. He said, this is the fundamental Arya thing worthy of your consideration and to try to figure out. So he says, beginning with our test, furthermore, a monk remains focused on mental qualities in and of themselves in reference to the Four Noble Truths. And I'm going to switch back to our text here, and we're going to go back to what brought us. Okay. Furthermore, the monk remains focused on mental qualities in and of themselves with reference to the Four Noble Truths. So he's saying here, remember that we're coming out of all that other practice we've been doing, where we're paying attention to our body and our mind experiences. We're paying attention to those things. And now we turn that focused onto the Four Noble Truths. And how do we remain focused on the mental qualities in and of themselves in reference to the Four Noble Truths? There's the case where we discern, as it has come to be, that there is stress, that this is the origination of stress, that this is the cessation of stress, and that this is the way leading to the cessation of stress. Now, what is the noble truth of stress? Birth is stressful. Aging is stressful. Death is stressful. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair are distressful. Association with the unbeloved is stressful. Separation from the loved is stressful. Not to get what one wants is stressful. In short, the five clinging aggregates are stressful. He goes on to define specifically what these things are, but rather than going through this text and reading it to you this way, I've broken it down as we have in weeks past onto our slides. So let me take you there, and we'll do this a little slower, a little easier maybe. So furthermore, our monk remains focused. And we just read through this not once, but twice, so I'm not going to do it a third time. But we're paying attention to that there is dukkha, that there is stress, that like all the other things we've noticed, there's a way that it originates. that we've noticed also, like all these other things, there's a way it ceases. And thus, there must be a way that leads to the cessation of stress. What is stressful? Birth, aging, and death are stressful. Birth, appearance and development of the aggregates and sense spheres and beings. Aging, the process of deterioration, including graying and weakening of the faculties. Death, the cessation of life and the breaking up of aggregates. So we can see here, and this is pretty easy to agree on, that these things are stressful. When a baby is born, it's difficult on the baby physically and the mother. Oftentimes, people die in childbirth just getting off the ground. If you reflect on your childhood and your life when you were little, how difficult that is as you're learning and growing, and we see kids and we admire them, but there's a lot of pain and difficulty in that. It's part of the growing process. Clearly, as we age, we start to gain a few pounds, get a little gray, start to ache some more, get sick some more, and eventually we weaken and die. And we can't avoid that. Eventually, you will die, and we've already looked at here, the body will break up to dust eventually. That we can't avoid that. But here's another little nuance of this birth, aging, and death that is included in the sutta. And that is that everything comes into existence. Everything ages and everything dies. He's not just talking about the birth and death of the body. He's talking about the entire process of something coming into being and then going away. When you get mad at somebody, something triggers that and it's born. That sticks around for a while and you're on fire. And after a while, it dissipates and goes away and gets scattered into dust. He says this in a very subtle way, but I think you'll agree. If we come back to our sutta and we look at birth, whatever birth, taking birth, descent, coming to be, coming forth, and appearance of aggregates and acquisition of sense spheres of the various beings in this group of beings, that is called birth. So we watched through this practice, we watched things take birth. When we did the exercise with the coffee cup and we recognized our eye sees something and our mind births a thought. And that thought is there and then it associates to our memories. And those memories get associated and they stick around and we have an idea, a concept, an experience. Maybe we take that as good, bad, or indifferent. Maybe we cling to it. Maybe we don't cling to it. Maybe it's a factor of enlightenment. But whatever there is in the world arises, hangs out a while, and then passes away. Remember that this is the part that in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, where Kondanya gets enlightenment, the setting forth of the wheel of motion, the Dhamma and the wheel of motion, when the Buddha gives his first sermon, and the guy he studied with, Kondanya, says, oh, everything that's of the nature to arise is of the nature to pass away and gains enlightenment. This is the thing that he's talking. So he's saying here that everything is born and sticks around for a while and goes away. And if you look at that with the context of the 4 points that we made last week, that yes, we observe this, that it's important that we observe it, that we observe it merely for what it is, and that we'll notice that its nature is to come and go. And since its nature is to come and go, there's not really any point to cling to it because we know it's to come and go. What is aging? Whatever aging, decrepitude, brokenness, graying, wrinkling, decline of life force and faculties of the various beings in this group of beings, that is called aging. Let's go back to our presentation. Oops, I went. See, this is what happens. You get really excited about PowerPoint and you click too many times. Aging, the process of deterioration, including graying and weakening of faculties. Death, the cessation of the life being, breaking up of the aggregates. So we see that everything arises and everything passes away, and among those things are all the things that you consider you, because we've looked at those things and know that your feelings, that your body, that your emotions, that all of your experience arises and passes away. But in that process of arising and passing away, there is suffering. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair. Sorrow, sadness experienced from misfortune. Lamentation, an act of expressing grief, especially with weeping. I like the word woe. Pain, bodily discomfort arising from physical contact. Distress, mental discomfort arising from mental contact. And despair, a feeling of hopelessness in suffering. Association with what is unpleasant. Remember that we looked at, as we were going through this practice, that there were things that were pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And we noticed how they come and go. And so association with that is unpleasant, experience undesirable, unpleasing, or unattractive sensations or interaction with contexts that bring discomfort or harm. Separation from what is pleasant, lack of exposure to desirable, pleasing, or attractive sensations, the absence of contexts that bring comfort or benefit, and not getting what one wants, distress and dissatisfaction arising from unfulfilled desires. And he says, the 5 clinging aggregates are dukkha. So this is where we now transcend like just this discussion of that there is stress, and we see where the stress arises. And we see where the stress arises because of this practice we've been doing. Your physical body is a source of change and growing old and dying, and there it's a source of attachment. Feelings that are experienced as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral are a source of something to attach to. I want more of that. I don't want that. I could care less about that. Perception, processing and recognition of sensory input. So the sensory input comes in and we see it and we think, oh, that's a coffee cup. It reminds me of my trip to Hawaii, and I have pleasant experience about that. That pleasant experience in and of itself is attachment. Fabrications, mental formations and volitions. So this is where we were talking about the different defilements and the different formation, mental thoughts that come about. Consciousness, the awareness of the previous 4 aggregates. So your awareness of the 4 foundations that we have studied. And he says these spots are the places where stress comes about. And if there's anything in this talk today and this stuff that requires, that causes pause and causes us to stop and say, is that true? Is it true that these are the places where stress and attachment and subsequently dukkha arises? So the question becomes, why do we experience this stuff? And is there anything that we can do to avoid it? If there is something we can do to avoid it, what are we going to do about it? And that's the next 3 Arya truths, noble truths. Noble truth of the origin of suffering, the noble truth of the cessation of suffering, and the noble path of the way leading to the cessation. And we're going to talk about those each in turn in the coming weeks. But today, just wanted to introduce this cornerstone because that's where we're at, right there. And the Buddha has said, now apply this thing that you have learned and look at the questions of the wise. And the wise ask, what do we do about the tough stuff in life? All these questions that arise then, as we look at the questions that existential questions and the intrinsic questions, those questions that arise are rooted in our suffering, trying to find some kind of answer. That's what he postulates here. He says that the human problem starts by examining and seeing that this thing exists, the suffering exists for all of us. Why does it exist for all of us? because these things arise and they pass away. We're associated with things we don't like. We're disassociated from things that we do like. And we're constantly chasing, trying to figure out what to do about all that stuff. Dukkha is the bumpy parts in life. And he says the question is, what do you do about the bumpy parts in life? That's what I have for today. It's cliffhanger. Just the first noble truth. But like I say, I think it's the important question to ask. I'm not sure that it is what we ask most of the time. I think that most times we're asking those other questions. How can I get what I want? How can I keep what I want? How can I get away from the things I don't? How can I keep bad things from happening? How can I be the best? What should I do next? How can I find love? What happened to those things I loved? What am I going to do about this? If I don't do that, then what's going to happen? Maybe I should be doing this instead. At the root of all of those things is something. It's the same sense. It's noble because we all experience it, and the wise contemplate. What do we do about that? And so far, we've seen, he walked us through how to see it clearly. And we'll take it from there next week. I'm happy to answer questions. Let's continue this discussion. Anybody got anything they'd like to add? I'm going to leave it there for now. Chris, bring it.
So, it's interesting when I was listening to the talk today and thinking about, as you're reading, when he describes the Four Noble Truths, what he's using in Pali is dukkha, 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 dukkha. But, we translate it a bunch of different ways, right? So it's suffering or stress. But the point I was making is when you look at what dukkha is describing, like when you say dukkha, Pali says the word dukkha. It's this thing. And it's almost as if it's pointing to a thing. You can't readily put your hand on it, but it's like the disconnect of whatever the ideal is that's emerging from your mind and the reality that you're experiencing. Right? So the dukkha is that delta, the difference. And so it can in the moment feel pleasant, but we know it's going to lead to suffering later, right? Or it's in the moment it's going to be miserable, but maybe you can work your way through it, but perhaps this misery lasts forever, right? There's these different aspects of it. And the part of what I see and what we're seeing what's so, right? Really getting a clear, the five aggregates, the very function of existence means that we are plunged into an imperfect world with things don't work the way they're supposed to, but we have an idea in our head that they ought to, right?
Yeah.
And that's an expression of the dukkha, right? It's not the dukkha,
Right.
It's an expression, right? The dukkha is actually bigger than the word suffering, bigger than the word stress. It sort of embodies
Axle
all
just
of these
doesn't
things.
quite fit in the wheel. It just doesn't quite fit in the wheel.
Doesn't quite fit in the wheel, right? Like some are just not quite fitting, and it's
Right.
that not quite fittingness that actually is, where we end up. That generates our questions like, who am I? What am I here for? What's my purpose? Do my kids love me? It's like, why does the cat not like me? All of these different questions start to emerge, and it's out of stuff not fitting, not syncing, not doing the thing that we think it ought to. And in fact, that we think it ought to is the very reason that dukkha is there.
Yeah. Yeah. So this becomes the point of focus of our observation. Like this is where we're turning our attention to try to examine. And it starts to preclude some other things. Clearly it's not, make the most money I can necessarily, right? Like like that's not the existential question that's going to solve any problems. It comes out of this other thing. And so driving at that root is what we're doing here. What's that root that unifies? I'll read some of those questions here off my screen. So what happens after death is one on here, right? Well, there's a fear there. We want to know what's going on. So something drives that question. And so there's a root there that is a suffering that I'm afraid. What I need to know? What's going to happen? How about is there a higher power or divine being? That goes to me, that's just right along with what is the meaning of life. And I think the problem with the question, what is the meaning to life, is it brings in, there should be meaning, like Chris said, right? That there should be some creator, because clearly this came from someplace. Like all of those questions, you kind of bring it with you into, I want to try to solve my dukkha. Like I've got this sense here, like this doesn't quite fit. Is there a creator, or is there a meaning to this? Because like it doesn't feel like it quite fits. And so he's saying that there's a thing happening, and there's a reason it's happening, and then understanding that reason unlocks the unnecessariness of clinging to it. So we get to explore this. We get to keep exploring this deeply. Next week, we'll pick up with the reason why the Buddha thinks we do these things. And with that said, I can see enough baffled looks. It tells me it's time to stop talking. And wish you all a good practice this week. Let me know any further questions or comments. We keep going. I will work on sharing our practice presentation stuff then, so that we can conclude as we always do. And so, as we always do, we'll reflect on universal well-being. May we abide in well-being, in freedom from affliction, in freedom from hostility, in freedom from ill will, in freedom from anxiety, and may we maintain well-being in ourselves. May everyone abide in well-being, in freedom from hostility, in freedom from ill will, in freedom from anxiety, and may they maintain well-being in themselves. May all beings be released from all suffering, and may they not be parted from the good fortune they have attained. When they act upon intention, all beings are owners of their action, inherit its results. Their future is born from such action, companion to such action, and its results will be their home. All actions with intention, be they skillful or harmful, such acts they will be theirs. We will, as always, conclude with the salutation to the triple gem. Araham sama sambuddho bhagava Buddham bhagavantam abhivademi. Sawakato bhagavata dhammo dhammam namasami. Supatipanno bhagavato sawaka sangho sangham namami. Well, cliffhanger for this week. We pick up by just establishing that there is suffering. Now the big question is, why and what do we do about it? And we'll figure that out next week. All right. I'll stick around a minute if anybody wants to talk. Other than that, see you next time. Bye for now.
Weekend, everybody.
Good one.
Thank you. You too.
Have a good rest of your week.
You too.